Usually when we think about building something monumental, something that's going to last for centuries, there's this baked-in expectation of just pristine conditions.
Oh, totally. Like you need the perfect environment.
Right. Think about, monumental architecture. You acquire this perfect plot of land, you clear the lot completely, you pour a flawless, level, concrete foundation.
And then the chief engineer just points at the blueprint and says, well, there it is. That is where we build. All the variables are controlled.
Exactly. Because, predictability is comforting, right?
It really is. Whether it's a massive corporation launching a new global headquarters or a historical movement trying to plant its flag, we desperately want our origin stories to happen in controlled environments.
We really do. We want to believe that world-changing ideas start in sterilized laboratories.
Yeah, but that's almost never how history actually works.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Because then you step into the actual gritty reality of historical movements, and suddenly that pristine construction site is just a chaotic mud pit.
A total mess.
And today, you and I are looking at an origin story that is the absolute definition of building an empire in the mud. We are bringing you, the listener, along on this deep dive into the birth of the prototypical multi-ethnic Christian church.
Which is such a wild story.
It is, and what's so wildly counterintuitive about this history is that this massive world-altering cultural shift didn't start in some pristine holy city.
Right. It didn't start in a place with a perfect philosophical climate.
No, it started in a chaotic, pagan stronghold that the rest of the ancient world considered a literal moral sewer.
And that contrast is exactly why this piece of history is so vital to unpack today.
So for our sources today, we're pulling from a detailed document breaking down the events of Acts chapter 11, specifically verses 19 through 30, alongside some really fascinating historical geographical mapping.
Because when you dive into those historical records of the first century and you map out the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Mediterranean, you realize you aren't just looking at ancient religious trivia.
Not at all.
You are looking at a masterclass in crisis management, unauthorized innovation, and just the sheer friction-heavy reality of cross-cultural communication.
So by the end of this deep dive, you will see exactly how a global movement was incubated in the unlikeliest of places.
It's essentially a story of traumatized refugees and rogue agents making unauthorized moves.
Yeah, plus high-stakes corporate audits and the forging of a completely new human identity. But, to really grasp how this movement changed everything, we have to look closely at the soil it grew in.
You can't appreciate the flower without looking at the dirt.
Exactly. Because if I'm launching a startup religion, or really any kind of moral movement, I am looking for a demographic that is at least somewhat receptive to my core values.
Right, you want an easy target audience.
Right. I'm looking for a cultural hub that aligns with what I'm selling. But Antioch was the exact opposite of that.
Far from it. To understand the sheer scale and the overwhelming sensory reality of Antioch, you have to picture the geopolitical map of the Greco-Roman world in the first century.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So Antioch was this massive urban center in Syria. In fact, it was the third largest city in the entire known world at the time.
Which is just staggering when you think about it. The only cities bigger are Rome at number 1 and Alexandria down in Egypt at number 2. Okay?
Exactly. Antioch is the seat of the Syrian government. It is a metropolis of roughly 500,000 people.
Wow.
Which, by ancient standards, is a sprawling, unimaginably dense urban jungle. You have to imagine the noise, the crowding, the constant churn of trade, bureaucracy, military presence.
Just absolute sensory overload.
Completely. And it sat right on the Orontes River, connecting the trade routes of the east with the Mediterranean Sea. So wealth is just pouring in from every single direction.
And with that immense wealth and political power came a culture that was deeply systematically entrenched in pagan worship.
Oh, deeply.
Let's talk about that worship.
Yeah.
Because I think modern people, they hear the word pagan and they just picture some old marble statues in a quiet museum.
Yeah, like an art exhibit.
Right. But historical accounts show that just 5 miles outside the city center of Antioch stood the Grove of Daphne.
Which was huge.
Yeah. It housed these massive, imposing temples dedicated to Apollo, Artemis, and Astarte.
Right, and it is crucial to understand how these temple complexes actually function. They weren't just places you went for an hour on a Sunday.
They were the center of everything.
Exactly. These temples were the economic engines and social epicenters of the city. To participate in the civic life of Antioch meant participating in the temple life.
So you couldn't really separate the two.
Not at all. The meat sold in the marketplaces was almost entirely sacrificed to these idols first. Guild meetings, political banquets, social gatherings, they all took place in the dining rooms of these temples.
Wow. And the worship itself, particularly of Astarte, involved rampant, institutionalized temple prostitution, right?
Yes, the religion of the city was fundamentally tied to sexual indulgence, extreme wealth, and public spectacle.
So it's not neutral territory
Yeah.
at all.
No, the dominant culture is aggressive.
It's loud, and it is entirely built around a worldview that is diametrically opposed to the strict, monotheistic, ethically rigid worldview of first-century Judaism or the early Jesus movement.
Exactly. It was notoriously decadent. You read the historical accounts of the era, and there's this infamous quote from the Roman satirist Juvenal.
Oh, I love this quote. It's so visceral.
It really is. He was actually writing a complaint about the decaying moral state of his own city, Rome. And to illustrate how bad things had gotten in Rome, he wrote, "The sewage of the Syrian Orontes has for long been discharged into the Tiber."
That imagery is just incredible. So the Orontes is the river flowing through Antioch, and the Tiber is the river flowing through Rome.
Right. He is literally using the metaphor of raw, toxic sewage.
Juvenal is basically arguing that Antioch is so culturally corrupt, so morally bankrupt, that its cultural runoff is flowing across the entire Mediterranean and polluting the capital of the Roman Empire.
And geographically, Rome is over 1,300 miles away from Antioch.
Which is crazy. The cultural pollution of Antioch was so potent that people living at the absolute center of global power were complaining about the stench of it reaching their doorsteps.
It's hard to even overstate how bad its reputation was.
It's like having a city with all the sprawling political bureaucracy of Washington, D.C., combined with the neon-lit, 24/7 hyper-indulgence of Las Vegas,
Yes.
but magnified to an empire-wide scale. A city designed for excess.
That is the exact environment we are talking about. It was a city that polite religious society looked at and deemed an absolute lost cause.
Which brings me to a massive point of confusion. Let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Okay, go for it.
If you are the architect of a new, pure, historically unprecedented religious movement, why on earth would you choose the cultural equivalent of a toxic waste dump as your primary launchpad?
It seems completely counterintuitive.
Right. Geographically and strategically, going from the relative religious isolation of Jerusalem straight into the sewage of Antioch makes zero tactical sense. Was this just a strategic blunder that just happened to work out?
What's fascinating here is that it looks like a blunder if you assume that a powerful movement requires a sterile environment.
Okay.
But the historical record we are analyzing posits a completely different thesis. The underlying mechanism here is the idea that there is no such thing as a hopeless situation.
Oh. Okay.
In fact, toxicity can act as a profound incubator. Think about it sociologically. If you plant a new idea in a culture that already mostly agrees with you, it blends in.
It loses its distinct edge.
Exactly. But if you plant a radically different, highly disciplined, community-focused movement in the middle of a hyper-individualistic, morally chaotic metropolis, the contrast becomes blindingly obvious.
It's the contrast principle. A candle doesn't look like much in the daylight, but you light it in a pitch-black cave, and it's the only thing you can look at.
Precisely. The movement didn't take its greatest stride forward in the safety of Jerusalem, where everyone already shared their foundational worldview.
It took its greatest leap in the very sewage Juvenal was complaining about.
It sets a massive historical precedent. This movement thrives despite the conditions, not because of them.
The friction of Antioch, just the absolute clash of worldviews, forced the early believers to define exactly who they were.
The toxicity of the soil actually produced the most resilient iteration of the faith.
Okay, that makes sense theoretically. The resistance builds the muscle. But practically speaking, how did they get there?
Well,
Because they didn't have a marketing committee in Jerusalem that pointed at a map of Syria and said, let's launch a disruptive campaign in Antioch to leverage the contrast principle.
no, they definitely didn't book a corporate retreat to brainstorm this.
Right. So if Antioch was such a wild place, the founders of this movement surely didn't just book a vacation there.
No, not at all. The migration to Antioch wasn't born out of strategic brilliance. It was born out of absolute trauma.
Right. The catalyst is pure crisis. The historical trigger for this entire geographic shift stems from the execution of a man named Stephen down in Jerusalem.
And this wasn't just a quiet political assassination.
No, it was a violent mob lynching that ignited a massive, terrifying wave of persecution against the early believers.
We have to really sit with the psychological reality of that moment. These people weren't missionaries setting out with a grand plan.
They were refugees.
Exactly. Overnight, their homes are no longer safe. Their livelihoods are destroyed. They are fleeing for their absolute lives.
The historical records tell us they scattered out of Jerusalem like a kicked anthill.
They traveled up the coast into Phoenicia. Some fled across the Mediterranean to the island of Cyprus.
And a large contingent kept walking north, hundreds of miles, until they eventually bled into the sprawling, anonymous crowds of Antioch.
And put yourself in the shoes of one of those refugees.
Right.
You've just survived a purge. You are traumatized.
You finally arrive in Antioch, this loud, strange, deeply pagan city smelling of sacrificed meat and foreign incense.
Your natural human instinct is going to be pure self-preservation.
Yeah. You are going to look for a neighborhood where people look like you, speak your language, and understand your customs. You want a safe harbor.
Which is exactly what we see happening initially. The psychological response is to form an enclave.
The records explicitly note that when these scattered Jewish believers arrived in these new regions, they were speaking the message to absolutely no one except other Jews.
They went straight to the local synagogues. They kept their heads down.
And honestly, who can blame them? I mean, they are just trying to survive.
Absolutely.
But there is also a deep structural reason why they didn't talk to anyone else, right? It wasn't just fear. It was centuries of ingrained cultural and religious programming.
Yes. We have to understand the Jewish purity laws of the first century. The separation between Jew and Gentile wasn't just a mild cultural preference.
It was a strict, religiously mandated boundary.
To a first-century Jew, the Gentile world was ritually impure. You didn't enter a Gentile's house. You certainly didn't eat with them.
Because eating with someone back then wasn't just grabbing a quick coffee.
Right, it meant something.
To share a table was to share life.
Yeah.
It was a deeply intimate endorsement of that person's existence and worldview.
Exactly. Table fellowship was a sign of total acceptance. Furthermore, the meat in a Gentile city like Antioch, as we discussed, was almost certainly part of a pagan sacrifice.
Right, so if a Jewish believer sat down at a Greek neighbor's table, they risked violating their deepest covenantal laws.
The dietary restrictions, the Sabbath observances, the laws of ritual washing, all of these were designed by ancient Judaism specifically to keep the people distinct and separate from the pagan nations surrounding them.
So for these refugees to only speak to other Jews wasn't just a trauma response.
No, it was obedience to the only theological paradigm they had ever known.
Which is what makes the next detail in the history so utterly mind-blowing. Out of this traumatized, culturally isolated group of refugees, a massive plot twist occurs.
The biggest pivot yet.
The historical account notes that some unnamed men from Cyprus and Cyrene came to Antioch and just
Broke all the rules.
they completely shattered the paradigm. And we don't even know their names. History doesn't record who these guys were.
But let's look at where they are from.
Right, Cyprus is an island in the Mediterranean, but Cyrene is all the way down in North Africa, in modern-day Libya.
These guys are Hellenistic Jews. They are from the far reaches of the diaspora.
Okay, let's unpack this. Why does that matter so much?
That background is the key to understanding why they did what they did. Hellenistic Jews lived outside of Judea. They grew up immersed in Greco-Roman culture.
So they weren't completely isolated.
Exactly. They spoke fluent Greek. They understood the nuances of Greek philosophy, the civic structures, the daily rhythms of the pagan world.
Unlike the deeply insular Jews raised within the bubble of Jerusalem.
Right. These men from Cyprus and Cyrene had spent their entire lives navigating the tension between their Jewish faith and the surrounding Gentile culture.
So when they get to Antioch, they don't experience the same paralyzing culture shock.
Not at all.
They look out at the bustling pagan streets, and instead of seeing an untouchable, impure wasteland, they see their neighbors.
And they make a completely unauthorized, world-altering decision.
They step out of the synagogue enclave, walk up to the Greeks, the Gentiles who worship Apollo and Astarte, and they just start proclaiming the good news of the Lord Jesus to them.
It is a phenomenal moment of unauthorized innovation. You have to realize the sheer audacity of this.
Because up until this exact moment on the streets of Antioch, the Jewish believers had never taken the initiative to aggressively, systematically evangelize non-Jews.
It had never happened like this.
Now, wait a second. Pushback time. Didn't Peter interact with a Roman centurion named Cornelius before this?
He did, yes.
And what about the Ethiopian official who was baptized? Weren't those Gentiles?
They were, but look at the mechanics of those encounters. In both of those prior cases, the Gentiles had to take the initiative.
Oh,
The
interesting.
Ethiopian official was already reading the Jewish prophet Isaiah and asked for an explanation. Cornelius, the Roman centurion, had a vision and actively sent his men to fetch Peter.
So the non-Jews were reaching in.
But in Antioch, the entire flow of history reverses. For the very first time, Jewish believers are going on the offensive.
They're taking the initiative to reach out into the pagan culture. They didn't wait to be asked.
No, they saw the deep existential hunger in the Greek population. I mean, this was a population burned out on the empty, transactional, highly taxed religious system of the pagan temples.
Yeah, paying for sacrifices to gods who didn't care about them.
Exactly. And they offered them something entirely new, a faith based on grace, not on purchasing the favor of a capricious deity.
And the result was just explosive. The historical account notes that the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord.
The phrasing there is vital. It wasn't just intellectual agreement.
It was a massive behavioral turning, a total reorientation of life. Isn't it incredible that the biggest shift in this movement's history was initiated by unnamed nobodies who just decided to talk to their neighbors?
It's incredible.
This is such a brilliant organic development. But let's look at the corporate reality of what just happened.
Oh, from a management perspective, it's terrifying.
Right. These unnamed Hellenistic refugees didn't form a committee. They didn't draft a theological proposal and send a courier down to Jerusalem to ask the 12 apostles for permission to completely alter the target demographic of the movement.
They just acted.
They just forked the code.
Forked the code.
Yeah, think about it like open source software. The original developers down in Jerusalem wrote the foundational code of this movement. They built it to run on a very specific Jewish operating system.
I like this analogy.
But then these rogue developers from Cyprus and Cyrene get a hold of the code in Antioch. They realize the environment is different, so they completely rewrite the user interface.
They strip away the Jewish cultural prerequisites.
Exactly. They bypass the ritual purity laws, and they release an entirely new, unapproved version of the software to the Greek public. And suddenly, this unauthorized version is getting millions of downloads.
It's the most successful launch in the history of the project. That is a fantastic way to conceptualize the friction of this moment. Because when an unauthorized fork of your software suddenly starts dominating the market, the original developers don't just pop champagne.
No, they panic.
They panic. If you are the leadership in Jerusalem, you are terrified.
You hear rumors that uncircumcised Greeks who used to visit temple prostitutes are now claiming to follow the Jewish Messiah, and they aren't even keeping the kosher laws.
To Jerusalem, this doesn't look like a revival. It looks like a catastrophic contamination of the brand. It looks like heresy.
It's like a rogue franchise opening up without corporate permission, completely changing the menu, and making record profits.
Word travels fast, even in antiquity. The report of this massive influx of Greek believers hits the mother church in Jerusalem, and it triggers a massive theological crisis.
The entire foundational identity of the movement is on the line.
Are they a reformed sect of Judaism, bound by the law of Moses? Or are they something entirely new, unmoored from ethnic boundaries?
The apostles know they cannot ignore this. They need eyes on the ground immediately.
They need to launch a full-scale theological audit of this rogue operation in Antioch.
So corporate headquarters sends their investigator. They send an auditor. But the choice of the auditor is what I find so fascinating.
Why is that?
Well, if I'm a rigid CEO and a franchise goes rogue, I send my most aggressive rule-following compliance officer to shut it down. I send the guy with the thickest rule book.
Right, you send the enforcer.
Why didn't Jerusalem send Peter or James or someone to just lay down the hammer of the law? Instead, they send a guy named Barnabas. Who is this guy?
Barnabas is arguably the unsung hero of this entire era of history. His background makes him the absolute perfect bridge for this crisis.
Okay, tell me about his resume.
First, he is a Levite, which means he is deeply steeped in the traditional Orthodox religious structures of Judaism. He commands the respect of the Jerusalem conservatives.
But there's a catch, right?
However, he is also originally from the island of Cyprus.
Ah, so he is a Hellenist too.
Exactly. He is a broad-minded Hellenist. He intimately understands the Greek culture that the Jerusalem apostles are so suspicious of.
That makes him the perfect middleman.
But more importantly, the historical text goes out of its way to outline his character. It explicitly describes him as a good man, notes that he was full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and points out that his given name was actually Joseph.
Wait, his name was Joseph?
Yeah, the apostles had nicknamed him Barnabas, which literally translates to son of encouragement.
Son of encouragement. That is a very specific, almost tender skill set for a high-stakes corporate auditor.
It was the exact skill set required to prevent the movement from fracturing into a million pieces.
Because the leaders in Jerusalem, to their immense credit, realized that this situation required profound spiritual discernment, not just legalistic enforcement.
They sent a man who had the capacity to recognize authentic transformation, even if it didn't look like the traditional Jerusalem model.
Because the stakes are existential at this point. If Barnabas walks into Antioch, takes one look at Jews and Greeks eating at the same table, and decides this is a violation of the Torah,
He shuts it down. He declares them heretics.
the Jerusalem church excommunicates the Antioch church, and Christianity likely remains a localized, deeply fractured sect of Judaism that eventually fades into history.
The entire future of global, multi-ethnic evangelism hung in the balance based on how Barnabas would react and what he would report back.
And what did he see? How does an auditor measure something as intangible as a spiritual awakening?
Well, the record says that when Barnabas arrived and saw the grace of God, he rejoiced.
He rejoiced. He didn't write up a citation.
Notice what he didn't do. He didn't ask to see their circumcision certificates. He didn't inspect their kitchens to make sure the meat was strictly kosher.
He didn't measure their adherence to the cultural markers of Judaism.
No, he looked at the fruit of their lives. He saw Greeks who had previously been entirely consumed by the decadence, greed, and idolatry of Antioch, now living in sacrificial love, purity, and devotion to the Messiah.
He recognized the undeniable signature of divine grace.
Exactly.
He looked at the unauthorized software code and realized, this isn't a virus, this is the upgrade.
And true to his nickname, the son of encouragement, he didn't try to micromanage them back into a Jewish mold. He validated them.
He encouraged all of them to remain true to the Lord with devoted hearts. By doing so, he gave this rogue, multi-ethnic experiment the official stamp of approval from the mother church.
And that validation acts as an absolute accelerant. The text notes that because of Barnabas' leadership and his goodness, a significant number of people were brought to the Lord.
The movement doesn't just survive the audit, it hits a phase of hypergrowth.
Huge growth.
But anyone who has ever studied organizational dynamics knows that surviving a crisis is one thing, right? Managing hypergrowth is an entirely different nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. Validation is great, but management is harder.
Right. Barnabas quickly realizes the Antioch movement is too massive for him to handle alone.
Barnabas is an incredibly gifted encourager and validator, but suddenly he is looking at a congregation of thousands of people.
It's a volatile, unprecedented mix of traditional Jewish refugees and brand new, completely untethered Greek converts.
This sociological friction in that room would have been staggering.
They need specialized help, which leads to a crucial recruitment mission. They need deep, robust theological frameworks to figure out how to live together.
Barnabas realizes he is out of his depth. He cannot shoulder the teaching and management of this massive incubator alone.
He needs a partner. He needs someone with the intellectual horsepower to build the theological architecture for this new, blended society.
So what does he do?
Which leads to what I think is one of the most intriguing recruitment missions in history. Because Barnabas doesn't send a letter back to Jerusalem asking for a committee of teachers.
He doesn't look for an established rabbi.
He leaves his post in Antioch and sets out on a very specific, very arduous journey.
He goes headhunting. The historical account tells us he departs for Tarsus to look for Saul.
No, wait. Stop right there. This is a crucial detail. If we map this out, going from Antioch to Tarsus is a journey of about 90 miles to the north.
Over the Amanus Mountains or by sea.
Ancient travel was dangerous, expensive, and incredibly time-consuming. Here's where it gets really interesting. Barnabas is the lead executive of the fastest-growing movement on the planet, and he completely abandons his post to take a grueling 90-mile road trip to track down one specific guy.
It's a massive risk.
Why is he so obsessed with finding Saul?
To understand the necessity of this journey, we have to look deeply at who Saul was at this exact moment in history.
Let's do it.
When modern people hear Saul, they immediately think of the Apostle Paul. You know, the guy who wrote half the New Testament, stood before emperors, and changed Western civilization.
We have this dramatically compressed timeline in our heads. Saul gets blinded on the road to Damascus, converts, and immediately starts planting churches globally.
Right, the overnight success story. But the historical record shows a massive, often ignored gap in that timeline.
A profound gap. By the time Barnabas goes looking for him in Tarsus, Saul has actually been laboring in near total obscurity for roughly 9 years since his conversion.
9 years.
And the historical text explicitly admits we have no record of it.
He was undoubtedly active, likely preaching in the synagogues of Cilicia and Syria, perhaps facing massive rejection, but he was entirely off the global radar.
Let's really unpack the psychology of that waiting period, because it is staggering. Saul was a prodigy.
He was the intellectual elite of Jerusalem.
Trained by the greatest rabbis, a rising star in the religious establishment. Then he has this earth-shattering revelation that completely upends his life. He loses his status, his career, his community.
And his reward for this profound awakening is a decade of irrelevance in a provincial capital.
We always expect instant success, but one of history's most famous figures was basically working in obscurity for nearly a decade before he got the call to the big leagues.
It is the ultimate crucible of humility. Think about the unlearning that had to take place during those 9 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He had to completely deconstruct his rigid Pharisaical worldview and reconstruct an entirely new understanding of the Hebrew scriptures in light of the Messiah.
He was being deeply formed in the shadows. He was learning how to suffer, how to be misunderstood, and how to articulate this new faith without the prestigious backing of the Jerusalem establishment.
But that hidden preparation is exactly why Barnabas knew Saul was the perfect hire, the only man for the job in Antioch.
Barnabas wasn't making a blind gamble. This was a highly calculated recruitment based on deep existing trust.
You have to remember their history. Years prior, when Saul first returned to Jerusalem after his conversion, the entire church was terrified of him.
Right, they thought it was a trap by their former persecutor.
Who was the one man who stepped up, risked his own reputation, and sponsored Saul before the apostles?
It was Barnabas. He vouched for him when he was radioactive.
Exactly. Barnabas knew Saul's character intimately. He knew the depth of his intellect, and crucially, he knew that God had given Saul a very specific, unique calling.
To be the primary vessel to bear the name of the Lord to the Gentiles.
Barnabas looks at the explosive, chaotic Gentile awakening in Antioch, remembers the specific calling on Saul's life, and realizes the lock has finally found its key.
So Barnabas treks 90 miles, pulls this brilliant, seasoned, deeply humbled man out of obscurity and brings him back into the chaos of Antioch.
And what happens next is a masterstroke of mentorship and organizational discipline.
They don't just host a series of massive rallies to capitalize on the hype, they lock themselves in a room and build a foundation.
The text says that for a whole year, this is roughly around AD 43, about 10 years after the inception of the movement.
For an entire year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught a massive number of people.
This is the incubator phase. They are doing the grueling, unglamorous, deeply structural work of discipleship.
Imagine the complexity of those teaching sessions.
Yeah.
You have Jewish believers who have memorized the Torah, sitting next to Greek believers who barely understand monotheism and are still unlearning a lifetime of pagan superstitions.
Barnabas and Saul have to forge a unified worldview out of completely disparate parts.
They have to teach them a new ethic regarding money, regarding sexuality, regarding power, and regarding how to treat one another.
The friction of that merger must have been intense.
But a year of intensive teaching by this dream team crystallizes the chaotic Antioch group into something incredibly distinct.
Because they do the hard work of deep formation, they become so unique that the outside world literally has to invent a new word for them.
Yes, this is one of the most famous nuggets in the text. It was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians.
Meaning those belonging to Christ's party or Christ followers.
But wait, why does it matter that it happened here in Antioch, rather than down in Jerusalem where the whole thing started? They had thousands of followers there.
This raises an important question because the answer reveals a massive sociological earthquake.
Okay, so let's hear it.
It comes down to how the external, secular world categorized them. Down in Jerusalem, the Jesus movement was entirely composed of ethnic Jews.
Right. They still worshipped at the massive temple complex. They observed the Sabbath. They kept the kosher dietary laws.
They looked, dressed, and acted exactly like traditional Jews. They just held the specific belief that the promised Messiah had arrived.
So to a Roman centurion stationed in Jerusalem, or to an average secular observer, this is just an internal Jewish theological dispute. It's a localized sect, like the Pharisees or the Sadducees.
Exactly. The Roman Empire was obsessed with categorizing people by ethnicity and ancient tradition. Judaism was a recognized, protected ancient religion.
So the early believers in Jerusalem fit neatly under the umbrella of Judaism. The Romans didn't need a new word for them.
But in Antioch, that categorization completely catastrophically failed.
Because in Antioch, the multi-ethnic blend of Jews and Greeks made them impossible to categorize. The Romans are looking at a community gathering, and it breaks every rule of ancient sociology.
It was baffling to them. You have to remember how stratified the ancient world was. Greeks did not associate with barbarians. Free men did not associate with slaves.
And Jews absolutely did not eat with Gentiles.
Yet observers in Antioch look at this new community and they see a wealthy Greek merchant, a Jewish refugee, and a Roman slave sharing a meal, treating each other as literal family and sharing their resources.
The share table. We talked about the purity laws earlier. The fact that the Jewish believers in Antioch had been taught by Barnabas and Saul to lay down their strict adherence to the dietary purity laws for the sake of unity with their Greek brothers. I mean, that alone must have been shocking.
It was an anomaly that defied explanation. The secular authorities and the pagan neighbors realized, we can't call this group Jews because half of them are clearly Greek, they don't circumcise their sons, and they ignore the dietary laws.
And we can't call them pagans because they vehemently reject the pantheon of gods, they refuse to participate in the civic temple sacrifices, and they adhere to this incredibly strict Jewish-style moral ethic.
They didn't fit into box A or box B.
Precisely. People now distinguish this group from religious Jews, A&E, from pagan Gentiles. As the text states definitively, Christianity is no mere variant of Judaism.
There's an entirely new third category of humanity in the Roman world. Their identity was no longer based on their bloodline, their geography, or their social status.
Their entire identity was derived solely from their allegiance to this figure, Christ.
So the surrounding society coined a new term, Christianoi, Christians.
A brand new identity. That is incredibly powerful. They were so uniquely unified across previously impenetrable cultural lines that society had to expand its vocabulary just to make sense of them.
And that leads to a natural tension.
Right, because you have this incredibly vibrant, distinct, multi-ethnic powerhouse of a church established in Antioch. They have their own leaders, their own identity, their own massive momentum.
But how do they relate back to their traditional roots in Jerusalem?
Exactly. History is full of movements that span out, evolve, and then violently sever ties with their founders. You'd think the Antioch church might look at Jerusalem and say, thanks for the initial code, but we're a global brand now. We don't need your traditionalism.
And we're cutting ties.
But what actually happens is that a global macroeconomic crisis hits, and it forces this new movement to prove exactly where its loyalties lie.
The narrative introduces a massive external pressure test.
Set it up for us. What happens?
The historical account mentions the arrival of prophets from Jerusalem, specifically a man named Agabus, who comes down to Antioch.
And he has a prediction.
He stands up in the assembly and by the Spirit predicts a severe, prolonged famine is about to strike the whole inhabited world.
And we aren't just taking this on faith. The historical and archaeological context from the text completely backs this up.
Yes, this actually took place during the reign of Emperor Claudius from AD 41 to 54.
And his reign was marked by severe famines and poor harvests across the Mediterranean basin.
We have to understand what a famine meant in the ancient world. It wasn't just a slight increase in grocery prices. The entire Roman economy was based on precarious agricultural yields and a highly fragile grain supply chain.
So when a famine hit, it meant mass starvation, rampant disease, and total societal breakdown.
So Agabus drops this bomb on the Antioch church. A catastrophic global economic crisis is coming.
Now let's look at human nature. In a city like Antioch, a hyper-competitive, wealth-driven metropolis, if you get advanced insider trading knowledge that a market collapse and a famine are coming, what is the logical survivalist response?
Hoarding. Absolute ruthless self-preservation. You immediately liquidate assets to stockpile grain. You pull your resources inward.
To protect your own?
You fortify your community, lock the doors, and prepare to defend your stockpile against the starving masses.
But what the Antioch church does next is one of the most stunning economic decisions in ancient history. Instead of hoarding their resources, every disciple, according to their individual financial ability, decides to send relief money to the brothers in Judea.
Judea was a particularly arid, historically impoverished region that would be absolutely decimated by a break in the grain supply.
They proactively organized a massive financial aid package, and they send this aid, around AD 46, directly to the Jerusalem elders via Barnabas and Saul.
It is a phenomenal demonstration of unity. And notice the mechanics of their giving. It wasn't a mandated flat tax imposed by leadership.
It was voluntary and proportional.
Exactly. The wealthy Greek merchants who had recently converted gave out of their vast abundance, and the poor Jewish refugees gave out of their poverty.
They willingly impoverished themselves during an impending economic collapse, driven by a profound sense of covenantal love for people they had never met.
Who didn't even share their ethnic background.
This action completely redefines the relationship between Antioch and Jerusalem.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it establishes what we might call a massive reversal of flow in the organizational dynamics of the early church.
Reversal of flow. Break that down for us.
Think about the profound symmetry here. Originally, Jerusalem was the absolute center of power. Jerusalem ministered to Antioch by providing leadership and teaching.
They sent Barnabas, they provided theological validation, they supplied the spiritual wealth that allowed Antioch to survive.
But true community resilience is built when the periphery becomes strong enough to eventually save the center. Now, in the midst of a severe material crisis, Antioch ministers to Jerusalem with financial aid.
The material wealth that literally keeps the Jerusalem believers from starving to death.
It is the ultimate sign of decentralized power and organizational maturity.
It's like the rogue experimental subsidiary suddenly becoming so profitable and so fiercely loyal that it bails out the parent company during a recession.
And Luke, the historian who documented all of this in the book of Acts, framed this incredibly deliberately.
How so?
Earlier in his writings, he went out of his way to praise the original Jerusalem Christians for their unprecedented generosity. But here, Luke documented this to illustrate the sheer strength and maturity of the Gentile church outside Judea.
They actually surpassed the famously generous Jerusalem Christians by sharing what they had with a completely different congregation.
It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they weren't just a rogue offshoot, they were family.
What an absolute roller coaster of a historical journey. We really need to bring all the threads together for you, the listener, because the sheer volume of ground we've covered today is massive.
We covered a lot of ground.
We just traced the journey of a movement that started with scattered, persecuted refugees, landed in a corrupt pagan stronghold called Antioch, and was sparked by rogue, unnamed innovators.
An utterly hopeless environment turned into the perfect incubator.
Right, and it grew so strong under the mentorship of Barnabas and Saul that it birthed a new global identity, the Christians, and financially saved its own mother church.
A stunning historical trajectory that culminates in ultimate loyalty.
So what does this all mean? As we bring this deep dive in for a landing, what does this mean for you right now in your own context?
It's a great question.
The core lesson of this entire historical narrative is this: do not be deceived by small beginnings. Even in chaotic, hopeless environments, immense growth is entirely possible if you have the right mix of courage, openness to outsiders, and solid mentorship.
We all have a tendency to wait for pristine conditions. But the history of Antioch proves that sometimes the most resilient foundations are poured right in the middle of the absolute worst conditions.
And as we leave you today, our expert has one final lingering idea to mull over.
Yeah, think back to that incredible moment in Antioch when they received their new name. The text explicitly points out that the term Christian wasn't a self-proclaimed brand.
It wasn't a PR campaign.
Exactly. It was a label given to them by observers who noticed how utterly distinct they were. People outside the movement looked deeply at their community, saw how they bridged impossible ethnic divides, and realized none of our old labels work for these people anymore.
We have to invent a new word.
So I want to ask you, the listener, if a completely neutral observer were to look at your life, your community, or your latest project today, what completely new label would they have to invent to describe what you're doing?